It was September 17, 1967, and a television crew inside CBS Television City had no idea they were about to broadcast one of the most chaotic 30 seconds in the history of American television. The cameras were rolling on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, a variety show that, on paper, looked like just another gentle hour of folk songs and family-friendly jokes. But this particular taping would end with smoke drifting across the set, a drummer knocked flat on his back, a guitarist's hearing permanently damaged, and a wrecked acoustic guitar lying in pieces on the stage floor. Nobody planned for the cameras to catch quite what they caught. Nobody in the control room reached for the cut button in time. And when the broadcast aired, millions of American households watched something unfold in real time that no censor, no executive, and no rehearsal had prepared them for. This is the story of how that unedited moment happened, and why it became a symbol of everything the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was fighting to say out loud. To understand why two clean-cut brothers from California ended up hosting the most rebellious show on network television, you have to go back to a war that took their father from them before they could really know him. Thomas Smothers Jr. was an Army officer stationed in the Philippines when Japanese forces invaded in the opening months of World War II. He was taken prisoner, forced through the brutal march that survivors would later describe in grim detail, and shipped to a prison camp in Japan where conditions were designed to break a man slowly. By the spring of 1945, with the war nearly over and Allied victory in sight, he was too weakened to keep working. He was transferred toward Korea and never arrived. Accounts differ on exactly what happened to his remains, but the outcome was the same either way. A mother named Ruth was left to raise two young boys alone on a serviceman's memory and whatever work she could find. Tom, born in 1937, and Dick, born a year later, grew up watching their mother carry a burden that never fully lifted. There wasn't much money, and there wasn't much room for self-pity either. What there was in abundance was a kind of dry, defensive humor that siblings develop when they've had to lean on each other more than most kids do. That instinct to tease, to deflect pain with a joke, to needle each other affectionately in front of an audience, would eventually become the foundation of an entire career. Long before television came calling, Tom put together a college folk group with a forgettable name and an even more forgettable lineup. Dick picked up the bass just so he could stand next to his brother on stage, and one by one the other members drifted away until it was just the two of them left. What they discovered almost by accident is what made them famous. The banter between songs got bigger laughs than the songs themselves. Tom played the bumbling naif, who never quite understood what was going on. Dick played the exasperated straight man who had to manage him. The audience ate it up because it wasn't really an act. It was two brothers who had grown up needling each other for real, now doing it in front of a paying crowd. That chemistry got them booked into a small San Francisco club for what was supposed to be a short engagement. Word spread fast enough that the 2-week booking stretched into most of a year, and the young men who had been scraping by on almost nothing were suddenly commanding a real weekly salary. A record deal followed, then a national profile, and by the time television executives came looking for fresh faces, Tom and Dick Smothers were already a proven draw. By the mid-1960s, CBS had a serious problem on Sunday nights. NBC's Western drama was dominating the ratings so thoroughly that it had already buried two other CBS programs that dared to compete in that slot. Desperate for a way to pull younger viewers away from a show about cowboys and ranch life, network executives decided to gamble on something different. Two folk-singing brothers with a reputation for smart, self-deprecating comedy. It seemed safe enough. Ed Sullivan introduced them to the country as wholesome all-American kids, and for the first few episodes, that's exactly what audiences got. It didn't stay that way for long. Within weeks, the brothers were making jokes about the war in Vietnam, mocking sitting politicians by name, and giving airtime to musical guests who had no business appearing on a mainstream Sunday night variety show. And it worked. The show beat its Western rival in the ratings faster than anyone at CBS expected, pulling in exactly the younger audience the network had hoped for. Tom had negotiated something unusual before signing on: real creative control over the show's content. CBS agreed because they needed a hit badly enough to take the risk. That single concession is what made everything that followed possible. Once the brothers had creative control, they used it as a battering ram against the unwritten rules of network television. Folk singers who sang openly about their opposition to the war got booked. Musicians who had spent years unofficially blacklisted from television got a second chance in front of a national audience. When one of those artists, a folk singer who had been kept off the air for the better part of 2 decades because of his political associations, was finally allowed to perform a protest song aimed squarely at a sitting president's war policy, the network cut the segment before it ever reached viewers. Public backlash was swift and loud enough that CBS reversed course months later, and America finally watched a formerly banned artist deliver his message uncut. It was one of the clearest signs, yet, that the show's audience wanted honesty more than the network wanted comfort. The booking policy extended to rock acts that no other variety show would touch. Bands known for volume, chaos, and open rebellion against convention were welcomed onto a stage usually reserved for safe, orchestrated performances. It was an enormous risk for a show that was still, technically, a mainstream CBS property competing for a family audience. But the brothers seemed to understand something the network didn't. The same younger viewers who were turning against the war and questioning authority were exactly the audience CBS needed to survive. Which brings us back to September 17, 1967, and the reason this particular taping still gets discussed decades later. One of the rock acts booked for that episode had built a stage reputation on top of ending their performances by destroying their own equipment, a gesture of pure anti-establishment theater that horrified older viewers and thrilled younger ones. What the band's own drummer hadn't told anyone, not the show's producers, not the crew setting up the stage, and by most accounts, not even his own bandmates, was that he had packed far more explosive material into his bass drum than anyone had agreed to or expected. When the final chord of the performance hit, the drum kit didn't just pop with a small theatrical flash the way it had at other shows. It detonated. The force of the blast knocked the drummer backward off his stool, sent a piece of shattered cymbal flying hard enough to graze him, and blew debris and smoke across the front of the stage. The guitarist standing just a few feet away took the worst of it. The blast was loud enough and close enough to cause hearing damage that would follow him for the rest of his life, a fact he has spoken about publicly many times since. In the chaos and adrenaline of the moment, he reached over and smashed an acoustic guitar that belonged to one of the hosts standing nearby, who could only stare back in stunned silence as his instrument came apart in someone else's hands. Here is the detail that makes this moment worth revisiting all these years later. Nobody in the control room called for a cut. There was no retake, no reshoot, no careful re-editing to soften what had happened. The explosion, the smoke, the stunned silence that gave way to screaming and cheering from the studio audience. All of it went out over the air exactly as it happened. In an era when CBS reviewed nearly every second of the show's content before it aired, checking every joke and every lyric for anything that might offend. This single unscripted moment of literal chaos slipped through untouched. It wasn't a scandal that had to be uncovered later. It was broadcast live to the nation in real time, raw and unedited, a piece of genuine, unplanned danger sitting inside a show that was otherwise fighting tooth and nail against a censor's red pen every single week. Look at that scene again with the full context of what the show was up against, and it becomes something more than a rock and roll stunt gone wrong. This was a program whose writers were required to submit scripts, lyrics, and even finished videotape days in advance for review. Censors combed through jokes looking for anything political, anything religious, anything that touched the war. Guest appearances were trimmed, dedications were cut mid-sentence. Entire segments were shelved and never explained to the audience. And yet the one moment that was genuinely unplanned, genuinely dangerous, and genuinely uncontrollable made it to air completely untouched because it happened too fast for anyone to stop it. It's a strange kind of irony. The network spent enormous effort trying to sanitize the honest, deliberate political commentary the brothers wanted to make, while an actual explosion, complete with real physical injury to a performer, went out to millions of homes without a single edit. The contrast says something about what television censorship in that era was actually built to protect against. It wasn't chaos or danger that frightened CBS executives. It was ideas. A guitarist losing part of his hearing on live television was an accident the network could shrug off. A folk singer criticizing a war policy in her own words was treated as a crisis that needed to be managed, softened, or cut entirely. That contrast only sharpened over the next 2 years. By 1968, every script, every lyric sheet, and every finished tape had to clear a review process that started 10 days before broadcast, an impossible turnaround for a show that prided itself on responding to the news of the moment. Musical guests who wanted to dedicate a song to a loved one facing prison for resisting the draft found their words trimmed down to a vague, meaningless sentence before the network would let them near a microphone. A planned performance built around a powerful anti-war anthem, paired with real footage of police confronting protesters outside a major political convention, was pulled entirely before it ever reached the air, and the network reportedly resold that leftover airtime to a political campaign instead. When the brothers tried to satirize the censorship process itself, staging a sketch about a network censor gleefully cutting performers off mid-joke, that sketch got censored too, proving the joke's own point better than the joke itself ever could. The brothers responded the only way two stubborn siblings raised to needle each other knew how. They pushed back, hard, and often publicly. They submitted tame versions of scripts for approval, and then swapped in sharper material at the last possible minute before airtime. A game of chicken with network executives that infuriated CBS and thrilled the writing staff. That writing staff, incidentally, would go on to shape the next several decades of American comedy. Young writers who cut their teeth on this show later built or shaped some of the most influential programs in television history, carrying the same willingness to say something real on air into new formats and new generations of viewers. The pressure on the show wasn't coming only from network executives worried about advertisers. It reached all the way to the White House. A sitting president reportedly stayed up late into the night on more than one occasion to personally phone network leadership and complain about a joke or a segment that had aired that week. His successor in office pushed even harder to see the show removed from the air entirely. When a comedian's Nixon impression included a joking line about wishing he could simply switch off the war like a television set, it landed with enough sting that it became one of the final straws for a network already looking for a reason to end the relationship. That reason arrived in the spring of 1969, when CBS canceled the show abruptly, claiming a missed tape deadline as the official justification, even though the brothers had, weeks earlier, been renewed for another season. Few people bought the excuse. A newspaper editorial at the time accused the network of holding its own performers hostage to their creativity, and public support for the brothers only grew louder in the aftermath. Major sponsors, wary of being associated with anti-war messaging on primetime television, had already begun pulling their advertising dollars, and internal network documents later confirmed that sponsor pressure played a significant role in the decision to pull the plug. The brothers didn't simply walk away. They sued CBS for breach of contract, and the legal fight dragged on for 4 years before a judge finally ruled in their favor, awarding damages worth several $million in modern terms. It was a landmark result, establishing that a network couldn't hide behind a technicality to punish performers for content it found politically inconvenient. But by the time the ruling came down, the damage to their career had already been done. The platform that had made them cultural lightning rods was gone, and nothing that followed, not a later network revival, not a brief run on a competing network, not even a nostalgic reunion special 2 decades later, ever recaptured the same charged atmosphere of that original run. CBS didn't leave the time slot empty for long. Within months, a wholesome rural comedy show packed with corny jokes and country music took its place, offering exactly the kind of safe, uncontroversial entertainment the network had wanted all along. That replacement program ran for more than 2 decades, a quiet, comfortable success that never once threatened to upset a sponsor or provoke a phone call from the White House. Its long, uneventful run stands as a pointed reminder of the lesson the entire industry took from the Smothers Brothers saga. Safe entertainment survives, and anything that challenges power gets pulled the moment it becomes inconvenient. Decades later, The personal toll on both brothers became clear in their own words. One of them has spoken about how deeply losing the show damaged his confidence, describing years spent rebuilding a sense of purpose after the platform he'd fought so hard to protect was taken away. The other found other outlets entirely, throwing himself into hobbies that had nothing to do with television at all. Both men, in their own ways, carried the weight of what they had lost long after the cancellation was old news. Their full archive, including contracts, legal filings, photographs, and recordings documenting the entire fight, eventually found a permanent home at a major university performing arts collection, preserved as a serious historical record rather than a footnote in television trivia. Historians studying the collection have compared its significance to material held by National Archives, a recognition that this wasn't just a comedy show that got canceled, but a genuine turning point in the relationship between broadcasters, performers, and the government. So when people go back and look at that September night in 1967 again, the explosion, the smoke, the guitar smashed in real time, it's worth remembering what actually made it remarkable. It wasn't the pyrotechnics themselves, impressive as they were. It was the fact that this single moment of pure, unscripted chaos aired completely untouched on a network that was otherwise obsessed with controlling every word its most popular new stars were allowed to say. The real story isn't a hidden secret buried in the footage. It's sitting right there in plain sight. A network terrified of honest political commentary, unable to stop a literal explosion from reaching living rooms across the country. Look again at that scene, and you're not looking at a technical accident. You're looking at the exact moment television's appetite for control ran headfirst into something it simply couldn't edit in time. More than half a century later, that contradiction still feels relevant. Audiences today are used to think pieces about media control, about which voices get amplified and which get quietly trimmed out of existence before anyone notices. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour lived that tension every single week, in real time, on the biggest possible stage available to a performer in 1967. The brothers weren't trying to be revolutionaries. They were two guys from California who grew up teasing each other to survive a hard childhood, and who happened to end up with a microphone big enough for the entire country to hear. What they did with that microphone and what it cost them is the reason people are still talking about a single unedited explosion on a Sunday night variety show nearly 60 years later. The next time someone tells you that a piece of old television footage is just a curiosity, a funny clip to share and forget, it's worth remembering that some of the most important moments in broadcast history didn't come from a script at all. They came from the split second when the people in charge lost control of the story, and the truth, however loud or messy, made it to air anyway.